Memphis has a vibe, just as a really strong vibe. It wasn't like a rejection of Nashville, although I'm required as a Memphian to not say too many nice things about Nashville in one go. There's just this there's a mystic vibe over here. I don't know what it is, but I just fell in love with it.
Is there much of a scene for you to participate in?
Oh, sure. Oh, God. Tremendous number of musicians. And a very blended scene, age, race, style, all the ways that, in larger cities, music scenes tend not to be blended.
You obviously didn't have trouble finding that mix while you were out here. I mean, that was always kind of one of the driving forces of your music.
Certainly, yeah, certainly of my music. I mean, I've never fit in anywhere, so that's been a common theme throughout my life.
You feel like you never kind of found your group of weirdos at any point?
Oh, well, certainly friends. And initially, when I was a kid, I was working at the Knitting Factory when it was in like an avant-garde jazz club. And, those musicians and just people hanging out around there, I cottoned to immediately. That was a great scene to be involved in. But, just in terms of like going out into the world and trying to be part of a genre, I mean, I guess I picked rock by default in terms of which bins I was going to reside in. But, I've always been like a little bit too much like Tom Waits for the hip hop world, and a little bit too much like Tribe Called Quest for the rock world, a little bit too stream of consciousness for like the singer-songwriters, too heavy for some, too light for others. I've always sort of had my own liminal vacant lot that I've put up my tent on.
Do you get a sense of why you ended up specifically in that rock band to begin with? Was it just because you were a white guy with guitar?
Well, that's a big part of it, but it also, I mean, this is like pure business conversation. Is basically talking to labels and managers. They were like, look, this is where you can actually carve out a career. And in the other worlds, you will not find the same infrastructure in terms of how record stores relate to live venues and like all this kind of near technical stuff. So, but it was fine, I mean, we played with fucking Sunny Day Real Estate, man. Like we were. We went wherever they would take us.
Do you get a sense that in those days, in that point, I guess during that turning point, that you could have gone full on hip hop?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly as I met hip hop artists as the years went by, got along with them great. Did a tour with Redman that was just the joy of all joys. But the labels wouldn't have extended their hand to me. The infrastructure would not have extended its hand to me. That's for sure. Pete Tong came to the show once and was like, you guys should go the remix route. And we ended up not doing it because it was just sort of challenging to our identity as a live band. But I listened to tons of techno and rave and drum and bass and electro and what have you back then. So it wasn't like a leap per se.
The remix route from the standpoint of actually like remixing other artists' tracks?
No, of putting out a single and then having like 35 remixes by, different artists. The one big regret I have is Masters at Work. We're going to do a remix for us. And they were really expensive. There was like 35 grand to do a remix. And we had to recoup some of that money. And it was before I realized that it doesn't matter how much money you have to recoup. You're never going to recoup. That's just the nature of the system. So I was like, oh, no, that's too much money. But, those guys are like legends of house music, and it is a genre line I wish I had got a chance to definitively cross at some point.
In some sense, because, Soul Coughing was, obviously did have some pretty big singles. You were kind of coming up in the tail end of that era of record label. So things would completely change just a few years later.
Yeah, we would turn into boy bands in like 98 or something, which is when we had our only like technical hit. Circles was number 38 on the Billboard charts. So, one hit wonder status achieved.
Like genre wise, it would turn into boy bands, but then beyond that, it just kind of the idea of major labels and of that being the way to kind of come up would also just completely transform.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, they definitely in the early 90s were very taken aback by Nirvana. Nobody had really seen it coming. Geffen hadn't printed enough CDs when the single was on MTV. And, the whole world changed in a moment. So there was just a lot of money going to whatever they didn't understand because they were just hedging their bets. And, into like 97 or so, they started to realize that there wasn't like another Nirvana just waiting around the corner. And they started, taking surer bets on pop music. The big labels did.
You specifically, there's a tremendous amount of luck there that you came across at a time when they didn't really
Yes.
know what to do, because again,
Yeah.
like you said earlier, you're ostensibly a rock band, but you've got electronic beats. So they were like, yeah, let's throw some money at this thing and see if it sticks.
Pretty much. I mean, we signed to Slash via Warner Brothers, or Warner Brothers via Slash, and they were super gung ho about it. They understood what we were getting at. So we never had like a feeling of imposter syndrome in the context of the labels. I remember at the time the Melvins were signed to Atlantic, and I had friends at Atlantic, and I got the sense that like the label did not cohere behind the Melvins like Warner Brothers did around Soul Coughing.
So you got the sense that in spite of everything, they actually kind of understood what you were doing and did a decent enough job promoting you and getting you out there?
Absolutely did. 100%. We fucked up a bunch of times in ways that could have brought us much broader success. But they were great. I mean, my experience with Warner Brothers, belies every bad experience that I've heard of with major labels. I mean, one thing that I understood early on was that they want hit singles. That's what they do. They're not looking for your moody art rock masterpiece. They want a radio hit. And I was just always that kind of a person, really. Like, even when I was into, predominantly into weirder music, I was always like a guy that was into the hits. And so I feel like we adapted pretty good to that.
Was Circles specifically written with that in mind?
Well, the short answer is yes. The long answer is, I mean, like I knew I was still me, and I knew, like I wasn't like, the most perfect fit for, alternative rock radio. Our real opportunity was when we worked with David Kahn on Super Bon Bon, and it was when he had Sublime and Sugar Ray and Presidents of the United States of America and all these huge hits that were, I don't know if you remember the Buzz Bin on MTV, and he was like the king of the Buzz Bin, and we didn't do anything he asked of us, and like totally blew that opportunity. And so, I mean, there was a certain, sense of nihilism that I had after that experience. I don't know how. I mean, I wrote Circles because I'd sort of given up on life and was just kind of like, show up to the studio and like I would put a drum loop down, do a vocal over it, and then leave, and then, whatever you guys want to do, that's fine. And then eventually the label started calling and being like, hey man, still trying to write that single there? There was a lot of pressure from management and from the label, and that's when I wrote Circles. But certainly knew people that like dissected what was happening at radio and like, very mechanically tried to reproduce what they heard on the radio. I wasn't trying to do that, to be sure.
What does it mean that you gave up on life at that point? I mean, it sounds like things were generally heading in your direction.
No, well, I mean, it was just such a, I mean, like, I don't know. I'm trying to, especially now that I've made this album that really does sound like Soul Coughing, I'm trying to not focus on the darkness of Soul Coughing, but it was fucking dark. And it just we really were there. We were with fucking David Kahn, making the radio hit, and just all the things my bandmates were just threatened by. And they were threatened by me, by him, by I think generally by the prospect of success. I think I ended up in a band with people that just like, no matter what in life, don't want to be successful, really. And so my heart was just broken. Like, we were so close, and that was so close to almost that, it just destroyed me, really.
Was being successful super important to you at that point?
Yeah, I mean, like I've always been very strong in my peculiar identity. So I don't know that I thought we were going to be like the next Stone Temple Pilots size band, the next Green Day, but sure, I wanted to be successful. And it was one of those moments that like just the culture had like teed up what was necessary for us to have a hit single, and we didn't do it.
I talked to a lot of artists, people who really went through that ringer in the 90s. Certainly like 80s and 90s, there was still a lot of the idealism was still rooted in kind of the punk ethos, where there was still very much an idea, especially in the 90s, that there was a problem with selling out. Now, this is completely gone out the window now, right? Now that the only way to really monetize your content, as it were, is to get on a video game or a radio ad. But I mean, do you think that was part of the disconnect there, that people were sort of worried about selling out to the man?
Well, I found that a lot of people in the indie rock world came from money, and they had a choice of saying, I don't want to be successful. I want to be in this childlike state of pure artistry. And even more so than the artists, people surrounding the artists had this ethos that was really like disconnected from what I saw as reality. I never worried about cred, never worried about like one thing that would happen is you'd hear about a band getting chased by major labels, and they would instantly put out a single with some indie label, instantly put out a 45, and it was just so they could have had something on an indie label. And I just thought it was such bullshit. Like why not? Like, the idea is to make great records. I mean, I believed in not making shitty records, but the whole stance of purity is like, from Bennington College.
A lot of people do see a conflict between art and success, and I can appreciate that from the standpoint of like, often something that you feel like is a pure expression of what you do is not necessarily something that would break through into the mainstream. But it sounds like at the time you felt like there was kind of a brief window where those two things could coexist for you.
Yeah, it really, one of like the stupidest things was well, there were two very stupid things that happened in rapid succession. One was that we were supposed to be the single on the X-Files soundtrack. It's fucking 1996, the X-Files.
Biggest thing in the world.
Yeah, biggest thing in the world. And the label was like, you have to hold your record to do this single. You have to wait. Chris fucking Carter is going to direct a video. And my bandmates refused. They were like, we're not holding anything back. And like, so stupid. The other thing was Michel Gondry wanted to do a video, and we didn't want to wait for that. And oh my fucking God, like, how dumb. And somebody I know, like an old tour manager of ours, ended up in a bar with him years later, and he was like, oh yeah, I want to do this thing with crashing cars and this, that, and the other thing. And, because it was Michel Gondry, Warner Brothers would have given us the money. Like, and, we would have made this great thing, or he would have made this great thing that we would be very lucky to be involved with. But yeah, just another of the great stupidities of Soul Coughing's mid-90s run.
It's been a while since I read your book, but I seem to remember, you meeting a lot of them kind of in and around the Knitting Factory scene. So you were really kind of meeting these weirdo jazz or quasi jazz musicians. It's not something that would naturally mesh with the alternative rock scene of the 90s.
No, I mean, I think what happened with these particular guys, I mean, You're right. I mean, like literally everybody in the band had played with John Zorn. Literally everyone in the band had played with John Zorn. That is already art, jazzy jazz.
Downtown weirdo
Oh
jazz.
yeah, oh big time. We'd all done. In addition to, well, I'd never actually done a gig with Zorn, but they all had, and we had all done Cobra, which was this game piece. I mean, you'd have to look it up. It's a very complicated thing with holding up cards and making signals to a conductor, and once a month they did it at the Knitting Factory, and it was kind of the center of that sort of little avant-garde music universe. Is everybody coming together to do Cobra on the last Sunday of the month or whatever it was. But no, those guys, they don't want to be successful. And listen, so I wrote this album, Ghost of Vroom, and went to them and said, do you want to do this? We have an opportunity to do like a big crowdfunding campaign. This would be really easy. It'd take 2 months out of
You're talking about the last few years. This is a recent.
I'm talking about this album that's coming out this week. I went to Zolkoffing and said, do you want to get back together and make this album? And just what I got back was like nuttiness. And it really was like, part of it was 2019 was the 25th anniversary of our first album. And I was like, listen, we can do a big tour. We can make some money. We can make a lot of people happy. And it just, the level of weirdness in Zolkoffing is like, I know a lot of people from fucked up bands. It's if not the most like violently emotionally abusive, it's certainly the weirdest. Like the sort of the going theory in Zolkoffing was that there were no songs. As the songwriter in the band, I took offense to this, but literally there. So my manager wrote an email to we were sort of like trying to like make a real case for this, and my manager was like, one thing to keep in mind is that you need to have all the songs written before you go into the studio, because you all live in different cities, and because the budget will be less, and one of the luxuries of the 90s, all the songs have to be written going into the studio. And this just set off a fury from some of my bandmates, one of whom said, Zolkoffing had no songs, we were masters of illusion. And it was like, there you go. That's why I can't be in Zolkoff.
I saw that quote, and I feel like it was like in the press release or their bio or whatever around this record.
Yeah.
Abstractly or spiritually, I can maybe sort of wrap my brain around it. But as somebody who like knows these guys, do you get a sense of what the fuck that means?
I think they didn't like the kid. They were all in their 30s. They were in a band with this 23-year-old kid, and they just didn't like that he had a spark. I thought things would be different now that we're all fucking middle-aged motherfuckers, and what's the difference between 50 and 57 or whatever. But no, it's the same weird battle, but like I accept it, and I love the record that I made. I loved working with Mario fucking Caldato, and I honestly don't know if Zolkoffing 2019 would have made this good of a record. I certainly think that Zolkoffing summer of 1993 would have had a shot at making this good of a record, but I don't know if, as the human beings we are today, we'd be that really that good of a band.
I mean, it sounds like when you talk about the conflicts, that it's kind of you and them, right? I mean, that's
right.
The main source of the butting of heads.
Right. I mean, it was nutty. So two of my bandmates worked with Chris Whitley. Highly recommend a deep dive into Chris Whitley. He was one of the greatest artists of that time period, an incredible sort of bluesy singer-songwriter. Why he isn't remembered like Jeff Buckley's remembered, I don't know, but he passed away. But so he had taken out my rhythm section, and I bumped into him in a bar a couple months later, and he was like, those guys really see the singer as the enemy. Like, what's going on with that? Like, like he was just totally taken aback. He was like, yay!
That must have been validating for you, though.
Well, I mean, validating and tragic.
It's nice to like have somebody validate from the outside that you're not necessarily the crazy one, or that you're not necessarily the problem.
Right. Yeah, that was that had had the effect you're talking about, where I was like, wow, maybe I'm not insane.
Were you in touch with the guys at all over the years, or did you just sort of reach out to them out of the blue?
At some point after the first book, I reached out to everybody and said, I know it was tough to read that stuff. It was a more substantial like amends to make to them than kind of your typical Twitter apology of "I'm sorry you felt that way." But I very much was like, that was my experience. I wrote my experience, and I know it was hard, and I hope the hard feelings aren't forever.
We talked about this last time, and I don't know how much the two things coincided, but you were going through the program, right? So that was kind
Yeah.
of, were
Yep.
those two things, but specifically, were those two things tied together? This idea of kind of the book coming out and then making amends?
Well, I mean, I think as a human being, I would have had to make those amends anyway. Um, Certainly, I'm a pro 12 steps person. I'm not, gonna like bang the drum, and I'm not gonna evangelize for it. But I certainly am a believer in it. In your life, there's just some people you will never be able to make amends with, because you may, situations where you were kind of a dick and the other party was, legit abusive. A lot of people, for instance, if they have traumatic childhoods, they come up against this, and really what most people will say is like, you make an amends by living your life a certain way. And I always sort of kept these guys in that category, and I don't know what it was, but I was just like, I'm gonna try and repair this a little bit, and to a certain extent, it worked. I mean, there's so much weirdness in perception that there was only so much it could work, but I did give it like a real solid shot.
In the same way that if you have a falling out with a family member, there's still that underlying bond there, right? And
Sure.
that's something that you want to take more effort to repair. And obviously, being in a band and being a sibling aren't quite the same thing, but like there is sort of like a collective trauma, regardless. I mean, even the worst band experiences, there is a kind of emotional bond that happens. So I mean, and you were still there. I assume that there was still a closeness, just from the standpoint that you all went through this kind of crazy experience together.
Yes, I mean, the deepest friendship I got out of those years was with a guy named Gus Brandt, who's a tour manager, who now he tour manages the Foo Fighters. I don't know if tour manages the word, considering he's like bringing them into fucking stadiums, and it's a highly evolved position from driving Soul.
That's that Nirvana side project I've heard
Yeah,
about, right?
yeah, exactly. Um, and we talk about it all the time. It's just like, because he was kind of like xed out by those guys as well. So we had these years of like him and me sitting in the front of the van, and we had this whole universe of inside jokes, and it was this really special friendship. So and there's my agent Frank Riley is a guy he's the only agent I've ever had. He's very meaningful to me and important to me. So the real like emotional bonds weren't in the band, but you're right in that there is a shared experience that does have to be. I don't know if it has to be processed, but I felt like it could be processed.
Was the acoustic stuff a sort of a concerted effort to leave the past behind?
Well, the solo stuff came from a night that I went to the club Fez in the basement of the Time Cafe on Lafayette Street, probably before your time. It was during, I believe, the new music seminar, which was,
CMJ.
yeah, it was like there were two in New York every year. First, CMJ was in the fall and New Music Seminar was in the summer. And I went with our A&R guy at Warner Brothers, who was this like very snooty, like king of the indie rock snobs. And we sat there, and this band comes out, got a weird looking like little guy for a singer. And and I was just there because he invited me, and I was like, "Who is this?" And he's like, "Oh, you never heard of them? This is the Magnetic Fields." And so, and there was nobody there. And the thing about this club was it was deep underground, so you could hear the 6 train rumbling under you. And it was the fucking Magnetic Fields. It was incredible. It was just like just jaw dropping. Wow, this guy's basically Stephen Sondheim level songwriter experience, right? So my mind's blown. Next up comes this other guy, this sort of craggy faced looking grunge guy with an acoustic guitar and a little knit cap on. And I was like, "Randy, who's this?" He goes, "Oh, you never heard of him? His name's Elliott Smith."
Yeah, I saw that one
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah. And so it's like Elliott Smith. Like, first the Magnetic Fields and then the Elliott Smith. No idea who they were. And and that show just really changed my life. Certainly there was a part of being a solo guy that was about just being independent, not just from a band, but just being able to like roam on the road and be like fucking, corny ass troubadour style. But that show changed everything for me. There was a snowstorm. I think the next day, in my memory, it's the next day, but I went from where I lived in Fort Greene to the East Village and like trudged through the snow. And, the East Village was totally silent. There's like a foot of snow on the ground, and went into a record store and bought Get Lost, the album with Christian Brothers on it. And, I was off to the races.
Yeah. Is that Roman Candle or XO? Which one?
No, I think it's between Roman. I think it's just called Elliott Smith, maybe.
Oh, it's a self-titled with the blue cover.
Yep.
Needle in the hay on it. Yeah.
Dummies being thrown. Yeah, needle in the hay.
It wasn't so much that you wanted to make sort of a 180 from what you had done with the bands stylistically. It was really the experience of seeing what could be done with just a guitar.
It was a choice made out of inspiration. Looking back on it, I wish I had been a little bit more canny and figured out how to put just another band together with an upright bass player and a drummer and a sampler player, and stayed on Warner Brothers and popped out a couple more albums like that. But like, I was on fire to be an acoustic guy, like absolutely on fire to do it.
From the outset, when putting together this new group of songs that ostensibly represents this new band, I mean, that was something you could have just cobbled musicians together, or you could have been your own recording act and maybe dealt with touring musicians later. Given all of the bad blood between you and the band, what was the impulse to attempt to reunite with those guys?
I just felt like it's something that had to be tried. I don't know. I just felt like, 25th anniversary. And so the way I wrote the album was I got GarageBand on my phone and just started writing bass lines. And the only sound I like on GarageBand is the upright bass sound. So here I was writing upright bass line. I've got my Patreon page, do a new song every week for it, always fiending for new ideas. I went on YouTube and found the old classic Beats and Breaks Scarface CDs, which were, this like cornucopia of unlicensed break beats. So I started looping those and writing to those, and then the upright bass line. Started working with some rappers, just having them over, and, a couple guys from the Unapologetic label here in Memphis, and just started envying what they were doing. And then I sort of returned to that kind of like Tom Waitsy meets Fife Dog kind of thing that I was trying to do back then. And it all just dovetailed. It wasn't like I, thought like, well, maybe it's about time to go back to this. And, maybe I made a progression. It was really like all these things came together.
So at a certain point, you're like, oh shit, I'm making another soul coughing record.
Right. In fact, I've been put songs up on my Patreon, and people were like, wow, really sounds like soul coughing. I thought you didn't like this. So I don't think I noticed myself until, well down the line.
Do you feel like between the two, between the acoustic stuff and between soul coughing and what you're currently doing, that one of them is more of kind of a natural state for you? I mean, it sounds like you were just sort of naturally pulled back into that kind of music?
The first time somebody liked what I used to do better than what I was currently doing was an early soul coughing gig. And I had been, like on the anti-folk scene in New York and was like just dragging an acoustic guitar to these anti-folk
Sidewalk Cafe
nights
and
at Sidewalk Cafe. It was at Chameleon at the time in like 91 or 92, whatever it was. And so soul coughing started blowing up, and we had a weekly gig at CB's Gallery that was blowing up. And I invited my high school friend Carson Kreitzer there, and I was so proud of it. And she saw the show, and I was like, "What'd you think?" And she was like, "Oh, I liked it. Yeah, really, really I really like that acoustic thing. I really, hope you do more of that one of these days." I did an acoustic gig she lives in Minneapolis now, at the Dakota Jazz Club out there. And after the show, she comes up and goes, "This is what you were meant to do." So almost as long as I've been playing music, somebody's been coming up to me when I do a new thing and saying, that last thing you were doing. I mean, I did a tour of all soul coughing songs in like 2013 or whatever it was, and I just relished people coming up and going, "Man, why'd you play songs from Hottie Melodic?" It just like that was a great full circle moment in my life.
in terms of number of people who have heard of it and number of people you've impacted, soul coughing is always going to be up there, right? I mean, that was your big original success, so like to some degree, no matter what you do, it's going to be Mike from soul coughing. I mean, it's always going to be this sort of this presence that follows you around for better and for worse.
I'm never again going to be a 25-year-old kid on a major label at a time when I was suitable for radio. That kind of sucks. I don't have a real problem with aging, but it is true that you got to be 24 to be taken seriously as an artist. I mean, so you're right. I'm not sure that's got much to do with soul coughing. I mean, I think if I'd made Haughty Melodic when I was 25, that would have been a big record.
It's always going to be to some degree the thing that defined you because it was the thing that the most people heard and it was the thing that people heard first.
Precisely right. Yes.
It sounds like you haven't had any sort of issue with productivity. I mean, I talked to a lot of people, and this has certainly been an issue with me. But over the past year, during all of this, it's been incredibly difficult to be productive. It's been difficult for me to even like enjoy music or reading to some degree because there's this sort of overarching cloud. But it sounds like you haven't had a problem making music throughout all of this.
I haven't had a problem until now. Initially, I'm an isolator by nature, and my whole life is about doing that Patreon feed of the new song a week. So initially, I was like running out of the gate and I was working every day. I literally have 35 songs backlogged to put up on Patreon. And then I had to finish my second book, which took a couple of super hardcore months. So I got that done. That was a lot of work. Then I went through this period of I was trying to learn how to produce other genres of music. So I was doing these deep YouTube drill music tutorials, how to mix drill, what the snare patterns are, which plugins to use. And there was about a month of that, then maybe another productive month. And then suddenly I hit a wall and I got up and I sat down to the computer and I was like, no. So, the good news is I have another album written from earlier in the year. And I'm going to go into the studio with Mario and Scrap Livingston, my partner in Ghost of Vroom, in LA. Soon as I get the jab, basically, is the plan. Soon as everybody's jabbed up. But all I've been able to do is just sort of practice guitar, loop instrumentals and put them up and then just practice my Leo Nocentelli, Catfish Collins, Ernest Ranglin imitations. And then, there's too much fucking time on my phone, some books when I can get my head around it. But yeah, I hit the wall. I really hit the wall.
Do you get a sense of what flipped?
I got into a relationship, like a COVID relationship, that I guess I put more stock in that I thought I was putting in it.
More emotional weight in it than
Yeah, like I was like, oh, this is gonna be good. This is gonna go on for a long time, and it just didn't work. And I'm 50 years old. I've never been married. I've never had kids, so I frequently have thoughts of like, oh my god, like I missed it. I missed the fucking boat. Very dark thoughts. And I think part of it was, this relationship breaking up and just being like, well, there goes another one. Like there goes another shot. And, I know I'm going to be able to make records when I'm 60, but I don't know if dating is, possible, feasible.
when it comes to like everything that was going on in the world, the pandemic especially, that because you were throwing yourself into all these creative projects, that you were able to kind of push all of that depression out of your head.
Yeah, I wasn't depressed until starting like in January. Like I was doing just fine. I put out an EP over the summer, like motivated by current events, which was an undertaking, like getting everybody to record remotely. And so I was like on fire for the bulk of 2020. And certainly I got a lot done, and I have to remind myself like you really like maybe it's okay to take a break, got a lot done, but the feeling of depression and the feeling of inertia is just tough, so tough. And I've just been like, I think a lot of people think it's just them, especially people who are like sort of isolators by nature and they work at home and initially we're like, well, this is great, stay home all the time. I think a lot of us with that kind of mindset have suddenly found this kind of crazy loneliness, this feeling of exhaustion, despite having done nothing, being really weary. So I've been talking to a lot of people about that and trying to like, get like kind of a consensus circle on COVID depression.
I consider myself to be an introvert, which manifests itself in different ways. Obviously I can talk to somebody I don't know, or I can go up on stage or do like a TV spot or whatever without a problem. But then if I go to a party where I don't know anybody, I'm like that. I'm the guy in the corner, and it can be hard to reconcile that. It can be hard to reconcile because it does sound like you have those impulses too. It
Yes.
can be hard to reconcile being a guy in a band who is cool just standing up performing in front of people or being on TV, and not realizing that like you are in fact an introvert. And that would like, and to me it was like, it almost worried me how well I adapted to the isolation of quarantine.
Well, I'm really good at faking it in a social situation. Like I'm not good at talking to strangers, like initiating conversations with strangers. But if I end up talking to a stranger, I'll light up and be friendly and like I'm good at putting on the false front, which is not actually it's not something I like have a problem with. It's just who I am. Slowly over the months, I've been talking to other people who initially were like, "Wow, this is fucking great," like home working, whatever. And then I have one friend who still likes it, and it's Rachel Murdy, who is the voice of Janine on Ruby Vroom. Old friend of mine. She has a character she does named Gomo, who is a man who wears like a silver wig and has a mustache and wears a suit. She's always doing videos as Gomo, and she does a video as herself every day in the West Village of her dancing. She's done it every day since lockdown. And we have a theory that she was directly parodied on SNL a few months ago by Kate McKinnon doing this character that's like the dotty old West Village lady, like dancing and being weird. And everyone was like, "That's Rachel. Like she's doing an imitation of Rachel." And she had a little dog, which Rachel does. And Rachel, I talked to, and she's like, "Oh my god, I hope this never ends. I'm so thriving under this." But she's like the last person standing as far as I can tell.
You mentioned the EP that you did before, and I know it's the one with like don't touch this, and and singing about wearing a mask and all that. Usually especially with musicians, I find that they generally need some sort of distance between them and the subject matter in order to feel like they can tackle it. But it sounds like that specifically was you attempting to use music to kind of process the current moment.
Yeah, I mean, it just poured out, and the fact that there was this undercurrent of paranoia, like the Q universe paranoia, and I was, like I was hearing a lot of like counter paranoia from friends of mine, super liberal, who were like, well, you know who Q really is. And, it was just like, and it was just in all directions, weirdness. And then like the weird kind of quasi excitement of the president saying something totally fucked up every day, and like turn on MSNBC and like everybody's yelling. And I mean, not for nothing, my depression coincides with no longer having to flip off the TV all day.
It was certainly firing up some receptors in your brain, not necessarily the ones that you want firing up, but it was at least occupying us during the just long periods of boredom that have been happening over the past year.
They say that gambling addicts get their biggest endorphin hit when they lose. So people look at gambling addicts as chasing money. Maybe they think they're chasing money, but they're really chasing losing. And maybe it's this kind of related thing where like the brain is lighting up at all the like anger and outrage. And then when it goes away, there's an addiction that's no longer being sated.
I remember when Trump got kicked off Twitter, I just remember feeling like, oh man, wouldn't it be great to have a direct channel into this guy's brain? And we used to.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what he was thinking about being kicked off
Right.
of Twitter, but because he
Right.
wasn't on Twitter, you couldn't read
Right.
the direct id that was his feed.
Yeah.
Is the book another memoir?
The book's another memoir. It came out in November. It's called "I Die Each Time I Hear the Sound," and it came out in the middle of the pandemic and like totally flopped. And all my fans bought it, but nobody reviewed it because on the first book I was out on the road like all the time doing morning TV in Tampa. So I mean, hopefully people are going to discover it as years go by. But it's a bummer. It's a bummer to have released a book during these times.
What was the impulse to sit down and write more about your life?
Well, I knew I had the story. So, and I've approached both books, and I may yet approach a third one, just telling stories. And you can tell them poetically, by like beginning in sort of an undefined place and ending in an undefined place. It's like sort of weird, like Raymond Carver shit. Not that I would put myself on the same level, but like
Well,
that.
you compared yourself to Tom Waits. You might as well compare yourself to Raymond Carver, right?
I can. I'm stealing from Tom Waits to make it clear. To make it absolutely clear, I'm stealing from him. I'm certainly not considering myself to be his peer.
Canon, does music serve a similar function as far as like storytelling and processing some of those stories for you? Or are we talking about kind of two completely different sides of the brains here?
Two completely different sides of the brain. Like you can, in a memoir or prose piece, you got to get from point A to point Z. There has to be a through line, whereas you can write some pretty disconnected stuff in a song, and then when you look at it all together, you see like, oh, there is a thread here, and that's where you get your chorus from, or the song takes a weird turn. It's a much more like intuitive kind of Ouija board process.
If the first memoir was the kind of the drugs memoir, what's the through line to the second one?
God, maybe aging, like the value of music in your life, the relationship to fans, which is fascinating and challenging. Yeah, I mean, it's very. It doesn't have like the same arc that the Book of Drugs has, narratively, because it's not a life story. But I guess you'd have to read it to really. I don't want to be one of those artists that refuses to describe his art, but I don't.
That's why you have somebody else write the back of the book for you.
Yes, exactly.
The pandemic is probably a big part of it, but at the same time, you think it's just an easier sell to say, hey, this is the book about when I was a rock star and did a lot of drugs versus this is the book about kind of like aging and music. I mean, that's a harder, it doesn't have the same hook.
Well, I think it has a great title. I die each time I hear the sound. And I thought, like, when people heard the title, they'd want to pick it up. So I was really excited about that. I mean, certainly, the drug, fall and redemption story is a narrative that's like the new boy meets girl, boy loses girl, rags to riches. Prince pretends to be a pauper, just standard.
The 5 stories that everybody retells kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to ask this question, but I have to. What does the title mean?
So a through line in the book is, so there was a John Cage. No, it wasn't a John Cage concert, but you probably know about this. John Cale did it. John Cage, where they played Vexations by Eric Satie, and they played it for 24 hours. And at the end of it, John Cage says he went home and fell asleep, slept for 12 hours, and when he woke up, the world was absolutely new. So there's a lot of stories about like the first time I heard a piece of music, an experience of seeing music, and then the tagline is the world was absolutely new. So it's about that like idea of personal change at the end of a song, or however these pieces of music affect us in these profound ways that, science doesn't even know why we like music.
Vexations was like that Eric Satie piece, right? Where it was like supposed to take over like 7 or however many days that nobody played during his lifetime. And Cage might have been the first person to actually do it.
Page long is like 32 bars, and it says, and it's to be repeated 200 and whatever number of times. He was very specific about it.
Have you been able to recapture that feeling during the pandemic?
Oh, I haven't landed one during the pandemic. 2019, I was really diligent about listening to my Spotify, the weekly recommends playlist and the release radar playlist.
Discovering new stuff.
Yeah, just like, and if you and Spotify, I mean, people have problems with Spotify justifiably, but in the sense of a vehicle to discover music, it has been amazing for my life.
You're right, it has problems, especially when it comes to people getting paid, but like it's kind of a miracle that we have access to basically every song ever written at our fingertips.
And the fact, I have a list of like 20 songs. I think I put up a public playlist of songs that were just like life changing. I would say the most was a song called "I Can Fucking Tell" by an artist named Saint John, JHN John. And I just fell in love with it. It's a super chilly, like spooky, haunted soul tune. And I just listened to it over and over and over again and got chills listening to it. And, that transformative experience, the world is absolutely new.